Good morning, everyone. My name is JoJo. This analysis video will contain spoilers for the entirety of Steven Universe. This video's purpose is to revisit each season of Steven Universe and identify its themes and overarching quality to inspire discussion. If you haven't seen Steven Universe, this might not be the video for you, but it might serve as the review for those of you who don't mind spoilers. This is my longest essay yet, so please sit back and enjoy Steven Universe, 6 seasons and a movie. Someone asked me recently what I thought of Steven Universe. I watched the entire show during its original run, and the main word that immediately sprang to mind was inconsistent. It had an inconsistent update schedule, releasing in bombs every few months without clear season breaks. It had an inconsistent art style that has been torn apart online over and over. And it had an inconsistent reception, with some praising it as wonderful with LGBT-positive media and others, well, you've seen the thumbnail for Steven Universe's garbage by now. Despite the mononym of inconsistent, however, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. Hear me out. Post-release, many of the issues with Steven Universe's fraught schedule are gone. Like many other shows, you can now just binge it at your own pace. Still, I don't think the Steven bombs are the worst thing. It's an unpopular opinion, but the Steven bombs tended to sate a need for Steven with a hefty helping of the show in one go. It towed the line between feast and famine. Still, like I said, whatever you think about Cartoon Network's treatment of the release schedule, those problems are now gone. People have also complained ad nauseum about the art style as well. It's impossible to argue that Steven's art style is consistent in any way. We've all seen the comparison threads on Tumblr where different characters have radically different proportions between episodes. In a way, I see what they mean. There are two camps of people who complain about this. The first are the people who are just used to consistent art. These people have a preference, and that's totally fine, but that doesn't mean Steven Universe is worse just because it doesn't cater to your taste. The second camp are the animation buffs, and I use that term very loosely. Whether they took an animation history class in college or they're aspiring animators themselves, they call the art discrepancies lazy or blame the crew for not having model sheets. And this might be true, but cartoons, even and especially ones that have a similarly serious tone, are known for their inconsistency. Sure, Steven might be not on model from episode to episode, but how he's drawn often reflects the tone of the show. I don't know why people get a bug up their asses about this. Teen Titans in its original run faced similar criticism for leaning into its over-the-top anime style, but we don't see people complain about that anymore. I think, though, what people really mean when they complain about inconsistency, however, is the plot. The show manages to be fairly cohesive in terms of world building and background art and things like that, but the plot is kind of all over the place. I couldn't tell you if this is because they wanted to cast a wide net to appeal to a lot of viewers, or if it was because of poor planning on the Crewniverse's part, or if it was due to constraints surrounding the network, but it's clear that Steven Universe has an identity crisis. And here we reach the crux of the interview. Steven Universe's inconsistencies outside the plot can mostly be forgiven. The art style and release schedule aside, though, Steven Universe still suffers from its plot. I can't offer any reasons why this is, and I have no doubts that the Crewniverse did their absolute best, but the show at the end of the day suffers for this inconsistency. This essay will be a dissection of why that is from the series' beginning to its very end, taking the show apart episode by episode to identify what went wrong, and more importantly, what can be done to make it better. I hope this doesn't read like an autopsy, and I think I'll find myself being more critical than I really feel, but I'd really like to get into Steven Universe as a show. So without further ado, let's begin at the beginning.
Back here again, can't get enough. JoJo explains some interesting stuff.
I want to talk about the pilot really briefly before we talk about the show proper. The pilot features a very different art style to most of the show. It's similar to Adventure Time. I'd really recommend checking it out. It's pretty easy to track down if you just Google it. It rehashes some of the beats from the show and of the other episodes. I won't talk about this much since it's outside of the show itself, but it's worth a watch. I think the Pearl design is actually better in this than the one they went for with the show, which looks like a bird to me. Let's get straight into Season 1. Season 1 aired over the course of 2 years, 2013 to 2015. It's the longest season with 53 episodes, and it's also one of the most internally disparate. Season 1 mostly deals with Steven's coming-of-age story, many of the episodes dealing with issues that Steven himself causes. For instance, the episode Frybo, where he brings a mascot to life, or Cat Fingers, where he tries to transform his body. The season often deals with the denizens of Beach City. It deals with the burgeoning relationship between Steven and Connie, and the release schedule for the most part was weekly, so this season is one of the most consistent, all things considered. You could even think about Season 1 as the first half of Steven Universe, when Steven is developing his powers. The tone is fairly consistent here, whimsical episodes about Steven's escapades. As the season progresses, Steven slowly gets more adept with his powers, and it's a delight watching the shenanigans he gets up to. It's also fun watching the world unfurl, meeting characters like Lars and the Gems. Beach City begins to feel like a cohesive place with a rich backdrop of mysterious gem lore. It does a great job building suspense about what the gems are up to, but it's a little sparse in terms of the payoff. Outside of episodes like Mirror Gem and the Lion Trilogy, there isn't much in the way of lore, and the lore we get is scant at best. There's a lot of cohesion. A lot of episodes deal with struggles that are callbacks to older episodes, like in Monster Buddies, where Steven tries to communicate with a gem from the early part of the series. There's a theme of building on things here. First, Steven has a whimsical interaction with something. Then he later re-examines it with a little more maturity. Concepts like fusion are also explored. Near the end of the season, the lore begins to pay off in a more meaningful way. Episode 44 sees Steven meet Peridot, who is a brand new gem. New gems are few and far between during Season 1, so her introduction, like Lapis's earlier, has a lot of intrigue. Unfortunately, one of the most irritating problems begins to rear its head with Peridot's introduction. Lore intrigue episodes begin to butt heads with the more slice-of-life style episodes. One moment, Steven and the Gems are fighting for their life against Peridot, and the next, Steven is dealing with the mayor's re-election campaign. As time goes on, these two styles of episode begin to trip over one another, which is unfortunate, since the early season they flowed together quite nicely. Season 1 establishes a trajectory that continues throughout the rest of the show. Two distinct styles of episodes, two styles that rarely overlap and seem almost at odds with each other. The problem in this season isn't as extreme as what comes later, but it's still there. The best episodes in this season are the ones that further the greater plot of the show. Standouts include Mirror Gem with Lapis, Alone Together with Stefani, and of course the season finale, The Return, two-parter with Jasper. This season plays it close to the chest with details too, building suspense in a very rewarding way. It's like a drip feed of details, raising questions like, who is Rose Quartz, what is Homeworld, and what other gems are out there? Intrigue was at its peak, and it builds to a climactic finish with the reveal that Garnet is actually a fusion. While I do love the twists, I would have loved to see less meandering from this season. The pacing here is an issue, and the drip feed of new information can sometimes feel more like a drought. There are a lot of forgettable episodes, one I'd even call skippable, like Watermelon Steven or Shirt Club. I find myself skipping these on rewatch since they really don't contribute anything to the overall plot. The Beach City Slice of Life episodes do help to ground the series, but at the end of the day, they weren't made very interesting. With some exceptions like Ronaldo's conspiracy theories, there isn't much overlap with the supernatural elements in the Slice of Life tone. As the stakes grow, the Beach City episodes seem more and more out of place. It makes you ask yourself, why is Steven farting around with Lars when there are serious threats afoot? More organization with episodes could have helped this, of course, but at the very least, the characters were interesting. Seasons 2 and 3. Season 2 began in 2015 and ended in 2016. It's only 28 episodes, which is nearly half of Season 1. As such, I'm going to discuss Seasons 2 and 3 together since they overlap a little bit in terms of plot. Where Season 1 dealt with Steven's coming of age, Seasons 2 and 3 dealt with a more mature Steven. He's no longer a giggling kid, and he begins to show some of his more serious side. He doesn't lose his innocence, but as time goes on, he gets better with his powers and more focused on his goals. A good example is the Gem Cluster arc, which begins in Season 2 and ends in the Season 3 premiere. The lore's pace is still a drip feed, but there are answers to questions now, while more get raised. New gems and new fusions are still rare, but there's still a more focused arc that remains cohesive throughout. This marks a shift in tone and a shift in plot for Steve. Instead of lighthearted romps through Beach City while Steven grapples with his powers, there's an literally underlying in the case of the cluster, issue that he's got to deal with. Mysteries unfold in a well-paced way. This is Steven Universe at its best, with more focus given to the story. There's even a return to the time where the slice of life episodes were more integrated into the main plot, with Season 2's Joyride. Steven's interactions with Beach City denizens lead into gem-related encounters. Unfortunately, however, this quickly turns into disparate adventures. Episodes like Onion Friend and Drop Beat Dad lean heavily into the less interesting exploits of the Beach City goers. This trend cements itself in this season. Many of the Beach City episodes grind the pace to a halt in order to deal with some contrived problem of the week. It's a balancing act. It's the inconsistency I was talking about. The plot has never been better, with arcs and clear goals like dealing with the cluster and later dealing with threats from Homeworld, yet it repeatedly halts in order to rehash Beach City shenanigans. There are also episodes which reach into a new territory, a phenomenon I call the Steven Universe Uncanny Valley of Morality. A good example of this is the Season 3 episode The New Lars, in which Steven goes for a joyride in Lars' body. While there's nothing inherently strange about this, it's a little upsetting and strange for Steven to mind control someone he cares about, and the episode itself never addresses the weirdness here. There are also questions of sentience when it comes to Watermelon Stevens, as well as issues that crop up later in the series. Basically, the show brings up all these philosophically questionable topics, then seems to refuse to engage with them in some cases. It's particularly weird since characters like Stevani, there are often very mature discussions about things like consent or sexuality or mentality or mindfulness. Ruby and Sapphire in Keystone Motel and Mr. Greg deal with relationships in a masterful way, discussing things coherently so even kids can understand. It's a line that Crooniverse seems unable to reconcile. This is where the identity crisis rears its head. Does Steven Universe want to be a plot-heavy, mature show dealing with relationships and serious themes, or does it want to be a problem of the week adventure series with whimsical little cartoon adventures? The crew tries to have it both ways, and it's clear which style they're better at. The plot, like I said, is more cohesive this time around. Season 2 deals with finding Peridot, then the cluster, culminating our first encounter with Yellow Diamond. A few people complained about the end of this cluster arc, but I think it fits with the show's theme, a theme I'll talk about more in depth in a moment. Bubbling the cluster was a decent resolution, and it led directly into the next arc, which dealt with various threats from Homeworld, such as the Rubies and Yellow Diamond. The show also begins to integrate Peridot and Lapis too, and deals with Jasper going a little crazy after the events of Season 1's finale. All in all, these two seasons are full of highs and lows. The highs are higher, and the lows are still not particularly egregious. If only it could have stayed that way. Season 4. Season 4 is another short season, just 24 episodes. It began the trend of Steven Bomb, in which several episodes released at once during several night events under a certain theme. Season 4 is where the series begins to fall apart for me. Like I said before, the highs are higher, but the lows really begin to be low. Onion Gang and Gem Harvest are some of the weakest in terms of slice of life episodes, which interrupt lore episodes that slowly start to lose their focus. After the cluster arcs end, there's a return to an ambling, somewhat unfocused feel. The arc of this season could loosely be described as identity crisis. Steven begins to wonder about his past as Rose Quartz, and many of the episodes deal with her past, such as Mindful Education or 3 Gems and a Baby. The audience mirrors Steven's frustration. He constantly asks the gems about his past, but they stonewall him. This is the point where the drip feed becomes irritating. We feel, like Steven, that we're owed answers that are seemingly arbitrarily held back. Worse still, the rich lore is even more at odds with the slice of life episodes. It's almost like the crew wants to double down on these interruptive episodes like Rocknaldo and Tiger Philanthropist, even when the lore is reaching a fever pitch. Season 4 simply meanders, holding answers back from us and giving the audience unsubstantial material that they didn't ask for. Intrigue is harder to build, especially with the release of Blue and Yellow Diamond, which culminates into more questions than answers. The end of this season features a new gem, Aquamarine, but at this point the revelation of a new gem is hardly anything interesting, and they throw her away so quickly it doesn't matter. We're no longer concerned with things like that. It's like the show begins to raise more intriguing questions like, who was Rose? And then instead of working to answer them, it just introduces new distractions. If before the highs were high and the lows were low, the highs are now mediocre and the lows are extra low. People also grew tired of the release schedule around this time, and the show saw a decrease in fan popularity. Season 5. The final season of Steven Universe was 31 episodes, released primarily as Steven Bombs. Cartoon Network seemed to care very little for its own shows during this time, preferring to run Teen Titans Go than other shows. I remember entire days were blocked for TTG with only short breaks for Steven or another show. If Season 4 worked at a snail's pace, then Season 5 was at breakneck speed. Season 5 is, unfortunately, a mess. Instead of fixing any of the issues that the series built up over time, like unnecessary episodes and odd themes, it once again doubled down on them. Nearly half of the season deals with slice-of-life issues, which by this point are frustratingly irrelevant. There's no clear arc to the series, so the lore episodes are now flimsy and weak without a clear goal. Problems arise and fall seemingly without reason. Lapis is on the moon, now she's not. Pink Diamond is revealed to be rose quartz, which fails to have any impact due to both the obviousness of the twist and due to its treatment in the episode. Ruby and Sapphire have a contrived conflict in order to have a long overdue wedding, all of which rushes towards the final 5 episodes, which finally, at long last, deals with Homeworld and the Diamonds. All of the questions raised throughout the series are answered as hastily as possible, which makes one wonder why they weren't dealing with this in the barren drought that was Season 4. Many of the answers to these questions are satisfying in the end, but they aren't given enough time to breathe among the other issues that the show has to messily resolve. The most egregious example of this, of course, is White Diamond. I talked about the theme of Steven Universe before, a theme that has been the glue holding the whole plot together. The theme, of course, is forgiveness. Forgive those who have done you wrong. Try to look for different solutions and compromise. It's a little ham-fisted, but to be sure, it's excusable. The theme is admirable, and it's at its strongest when it sees Steven working hard to turn Peridot into a good guy. Unfortunately, this theme doesn't sit with the series' ending. As many fans have pointed out, it's a little painful to try to redeem the Diamonds. Seeing them do a heel turn from deadly threat to adorable moms is incredibly jarring, especially in White Diamond's case. I mentioned before Steven's tone problem with moral issues, and here it rears its ugly head in a big and special way. The Diamonds are literally space fascists who kill people. I'm not saying it's impossible to redeem these characters, but the idea that they could be redeemed in such little time with what amounts to a hand wave does a disservice to the show's careful construction up to this point. The entire conflict of the show, from Season 1 onwards, deals with these figures, the Diamonds, and the fact that the show resolves itself in such a hasty, blunt manner is jarring. The finale does have a great deal of impact, absolutely, but it's a little neat happily ever after that doesn't really respect the show that came before it. I'm being particularly blunt about this, but I should clarify that I still did enjoy Season 5 for the most part. It's just heartbreaking, mostly because it had so much potential that it chose to act on. The movie and future. Season 6, Steven Universe Future, kicked off with Steven Universe the movie. I'm going to discuss these two together for obvious reasons. They both deal with a time skip that occurs after the events of Season 5 finale. It's a spin-off series, in a very loose sense. The Steven Universe's movie was refreshing. It was a coherent story with familiar characters in a fresh setting. It was basically what fans were looking for, a new story with these characters. They were sick of the meandering tone of Season 4 onward, and they got it in the form of a brand new series featuring Steven. The movie also introduced a fascinating and fan-favorite character, Spinel, and explored the gems in a new way. On top of that, it was a fucking musical. As a standalone and as a lead into Steven Universe Future, the movie does a great job. The theme is quickly established. It's a deconstruction of the myth of the happily ever after, with Steven struggling with the residual feelings from the series. It's lovely to see what the gems are up to, including ones like Bismuth and Jasper, who ended up neglected near the end of the series. Jasper is particularly interesting since she's still upset with Steven. There's plenty to do, and by the end, Steven is traveling the world. It's a decent message, particularly coherent and focused in terms of Steven Universe stories. It's a melancholy send-off, but one that's certainly more satisfying than Season 5. The Steven Universe Future became something of a saving grace of the series, one final little package to wrap up the show with, another try after the flop that was Season 5. The way it reckons with Steven's own trauma and the history of Pink Diamond is also particularly poignant, returning the masterful way Crooniverse deals with mature topics when it tries to. I'm glad they managed to make Steven Universe Future. In sum, I've said ups and downs before in this review, and I think that sums up the inconsistency of the show very succinctly. Its ups are high, dealing with concepts that have a lot of intrigue, like gems as a species, with fusion, and with the world at large. but its lows are low, with meandering, pointless episodes of fraught relationships with its themes. At the end of the day, I'd recommend Steven Universe to anyone. I don't think the show is bad despite its downfalls, but I would have a hard time rewatching it. Later on, I'd love to do a video detailing all the episodes that are worth skipping on a rewatch, but this video is pretty long in the tooth already. Steven remains one of the most unique shows on TV, and in a way it's almost elevated by the fact that it's sometimes frustrating to watch. Shows can make you feel a variety of emotions, and even if they're not perfect, they can still make you think. Steven Universe has invited a level of critical discussion that's been hard to find in any other shows, especially from Cartoon Network, and people love to debate its finer points endlessly. If it were a more perfect show, I don't think this level of interest or discussion would be as prolific. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment with your favorite episode and why. I'd love to hear it. I read all the comments, so please don't be shy. Also, leave a like on this video. It really helps my videos appear in recommendation lists. Like I said, I'd love to go more in depth than just a season-by-season analysis, but we'll save that for a later date. Thanks to my followers on Twitter for voting on discussion topics. I'll be doing more topic polls on my Twitter, so if you're not following me, head to @FunkMcLovin on Twitter. As always, thanks for listening, and a shout out to my friend Leah, who helped me watch Steven Universe, and talked about Mom Swap to me. Have a great day, everybody.